Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents To Hell and Back, The Last Train from Hiroshima, by Charles Pellegrino, narrated by David Colacci. Foreword. In 1984, I moved to Hiroshima and have been involved with this city ever since. I translated for the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum for over 20 years, including countless accounts of the A-bomb tragedy. I suspect that no one alive has heard, translated, or interpreted the testimony of more A-bomb survivors than I have, with the likely exception of my wife. I know or knew personally many of the survivors Pellegrino mentions in the book you are about to read. From April 2007 to 2013, I served as the first non-Japanese chairman of the Hiroshima Peace Culture Foundation, the organization that manages the Hiroshima Museum, and I now teach Hiroshima Studies at Hiroshima Jogakuin University. I am not a scientist who can speak authoritatively about the inner workings of the bomb or its physical or medical effects. Nor am I a World War II historian who can say with scholarly assurance what led to the war or the bombings. But I have a comprehensive understanding of how the people of Hiroshima and Nagasaki experienced, remember, and talk or write about the atomic bombs. I have attempted to establish my credentials as a person who knows Hiroshima, and above all the survivors and their stories, because I want it to mean something to you when I say that To Hell and Back, The Last Train from Hiroshima, is by far the most insightful and powerful book I have ever read on the subject of the bombings. The horrors Pellegrino presents are accurate, based on eyewitness accounts supported by knowledgeable and reasonable guesses about the unknown. For example, what happened to people at the hypocenters. No book I know has articulated more fully, more accurately, and more effectively the essential nature of the atomic bombings, the experience of the people, and the endless aftermath. And, as all survivors will be quick to point out, the reality was vastly more horrific than even the talented Pellegrino can convey. With the world entering into a new era of nuclear weapons escalation, a book of this kind is needed now more than ever. As the filmmaker-engineer James Cameron has pointed out, the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki have always been controversial and are seen very differently through different cultural and national perspectives. As an example of how perspective and even agenda can recolor history, in the first edition of Last Train, Pellegrino was tricked by one informant. He believed an American veteran's well-documented, convincingly presented story that turned out to be false. When presented with new evidence, Pellegrino quickly admitted his mistake and corrected the book. Nevertheless, he and his book were attacked as if he had deliberately fabricated the evidence and therefore could never again be trusted. Obviously, the false Joseph Fuoco story, which added up to only 5 pages of the entire first edition, was not the cause of this rage. The fury became, Cameron concluded, an example of how the strong emotions surrounding this subject are still coloring people's ability to see history clearly, when a relatively minor research error, a result of a fraudulent or self-deluded witness and immediately corrected once exposed, could blaze up into a firestorm of controversy and invective almost 7 decades after the event. Last Train aroused such fury in 2010 because Pellegrino accurately depicted the cruelty of the weapon and simultaneously the humanity of those exposed to it. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as they appeared in Last Train, and now in To Hell and Back, were cities full of people, real, admirable, often lovable human beings whose lives were destroyed or filled with suffering as a result of the atomic bombings. Thus, even though Pellegrino expressly refuses to address the issue of whether or not the bombs were justified, the sheer horror he describes makes the bombings, and by extension the United States, and even humanity itself, look bad. This book elicits guilt, defensiveness, and rage because it transports readers to the extent we are willing to go, into a world that is more frightening and painful than that of any true story we have ever been told. And it is a continuing story of survivor suffering 7 decades later. The Fuoco furor, the attendant ad hominem attacks against the author himself, and the kowtowing of an American publisher leading to the 2010 recall and pulping of the first Last Train, drove Pellegrino to extend his research and write an even better book, more complete, more accurate, and more effective. In fact, history actually owes a debt to the more extremist critics. For example, their wild attacks led Kenji Hirata to step forward from a half-century of trying to stay out of history's way, and to tell for the first time the rest of his family's story. Having traveled aboard that last train from Hiroshima to Nagasaki and been exposed to both atomic bombs, he was among the dozens of survivors who came forth after 2010 to counter reports in the American press that asserted Hiroshima did not happen that way. Were it not for false claims that the survivors in this book should be regarded as possibly having never existed, Hirata would otherwise have taken his own story to the grave in 2013. Ironically, Fuoco's false story helped bring much truth to light. At the deepest level, I suspect the main reason Pellegrino was attacked so intensely is that in 2010 Last Train was, and To Hell and Back is even more so now, a potential game-changer in the struggle to eliminate nuclear weapons. Pellegrino worked with filmmaker James Cameron on Titanic and Avatar. He introduced Cameron to the late Tsutomu Yamaguchi, the most famous of the survivors of both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings, and Yamaguchi secured from Cameron a promise to make a film about the bombings. If Cameron were to apply his full genius and arsenal of filmmaking skills to a film based on To Hell and Back, it would help make nuclear weapons public enemy number 1 and herald the end of the nuclear age. In the context of the current humanitarian impact movement, a movement led by Switzerland to reveal the true consequences of any use of nuclear weapons, such a film would forcefully bring to light the bizarre logic that continues to dominate strategic planning, and make it impossible for any politician to both advocate for nuclear weapons and get elected. With its revised and expanded second and third editions, published to acclaim in more than 20 countries, the languages of the world's 2 nuclear superpowers, English and Russian, are among the very few major ones in which this book has not been printed, nearly 5 years after its first, briefly available English edition. As Pellegrino has often said, the crucial meaning of the atomic bombings lies in the future, not the past. The future of our civilization hinges on what we decide to do now, based on what we know of the past. To Hell and Back is an astute, powerful, and positive contribution to that process. Stephen Leeper, International Studies Department, Hiroshima Jogakuin University. Chapter 1. The Killing Star. Had Mary Shelley or Edgar Allan Poe been born into the mid-20th century, they would never have had to invent horror. For the Japanese and American scientists who first ventured into the still radioactive hypocenters of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, trying to understand what had occurred, the most fearsome deaths were the quickest. On a bridge located in central Hiroshima, a man could still be seen leading a horse, though he had utterly ceased to exist. His footsteps, the horse's footsteps, and the last footsteps of the people who had been crossing the bridge with him toward the heart of the city were preserved on the instantly bleached road surface, as if by a new method of flash photography. Only a little farther downriver, barely 140 steps from the exact center of the detonation, and still within this same sliver of a second in which images of people and horses were flash-burned onto a road, women who were sitting on the stone steps of the Sumitomo Bank's main entrance, evidently waiting for the doors to open, evaporated when the sky opened up instead. Those who did not survive the first half-second of human contact with a nuclear weapon were alive one moment, on the bank steps or on the streets and the bridges, hoping for Japan's victory or looking toward defeat, hoping for the return of loved ones taken away to war or mourning loved ones already lost, thinking of increased food rations for their children, or concentrating on smaller dreams, or having no dreams at all. Then, facing the flashpoint, they were converted into gas and desiccated carbon, and their minds and bodies dissolved, as if they had been merely the dream of something alien to human experience suddenly awakening. And yet the shadows of these people lingered behind their blast-dispersed charcoal, imprinted upon the blistered sidewalks and upon the bank's granite steps, testament that they had once lived and breathed. On that 6th day of August, 1945, no one who conceived, designed, or assembled the Hiroshima bomb knew where uranium nuclei came from, or what science had actually achieved. Not Oppenheimer or Urey, Alvarez, or even Einstein would have known that they had resurrected something from the remote past, from a time and a place seldom encountered in human thought. Each of the uranium-235 atoms at the bomb's core had been forged more than 4.6 billion years earlier, in the hearts of supernovae. The core was assembled from the ash of stars that had lived and died long before the oldest mountains of the moon were born. Mined and refined to nearly 83% purity, and brought together in precisely the right geometry, the primordial remnant of creation was coerced to echo, after ages of quiescence, the last shriek of an imploding star. In all its barest quantum essentials, what happened above Hiroshima that morning, and 3 days later in Nagasaki, in a separate plutonium cauldron filled with the byproducts of a uranium reactor, signified the brief reincarnations of distant suns. None of the men who worked this strange alchemy understood yet that the carbon flowing within their veins was, like uranium, the dust of the stars. Nor did they know that the nuclei of carbon and uranium could possibly conceal anything much smaller than the diameter of a proton. Indeed, Einstein and Oppenheimer had difficulty acknowledging that such quantum worlds actually existed within the volume of each proton, each neutron. They therefore did not know what neutrons were made of, or precisely how cracks in space-time, cracks in the universe itself, permitted matter to become energy. So primitive was their understanding on this point that it might have been compared to the thought processes of a Neanderthal discovering a cache of napalm. In like manner, the scientists never suspected that the forces they unleashed at that moment bridged their day with the origin of the universe, and bridged megatime with the travel time of light across the diameter of a proton. Though they knew next to nothing about how their briefly created echo from the past worked, next to nothing was enough. Inevitably, someone was bound to be standing below point zero. This peculiar distinction fell to a 35-year-old widow and a half-dozen monks. Mrs. Aoyama had sent her son Nankai away to his school work detail at least a half-hour earlier than usual, which was why history was to claim the boy as the sole surviving resident of the neighborhood. The Aoyama home was attached on one side to a Buddhist temple with which the family shared and maintained a large vegetable garden. By 8:15, Mrs. Aoyama was probably working in the garden with her neighbors, just as she worked with them every morning. If so, few, if any, other people were nearer the actual 0 point, or more openly exposed than she and the monks. Overhead, the dome of Hiroshima's Industrial Sciences Building pointed almost straight up into the center of the detonation. The temple garden in which Mrs. Aoyama toiled was located immediately adjacent to what would become known to future generations as the Peace Dome. During that final split second before moment zero, Mrs. Aoyama and the monks lived on the cusp of instantaneous non-existence, on the verge of dying before it was possible to realize they were about to die. At the moment the bomb came to life, before a globe of plasma's lower hemisphere could burst down to ground level, the top millimeter of the dome's metal cladding would catch the rays from the bomb and liquefy instantly, then flash to vapor. Bricks and concrete, too, were on the verge of developing a radiant liquid skin, while the air above the cladding, and over the bricks and on the ground, soared into the thermal realm of steel emerging white from a furnace. Unlike the man leading a horse across the nearby T bridge, Mrs. Aoyama could not possibly leave a permanent shadow on the ground. From the moment the rays began to shine down through bones, and before the layer of superheated air that enveloped her could move even an arm's length, her marrow would begin vibrating at more than 5 times the boiling point of water. The bones themselves would become instantly incandescent, with all of her flesh trying simultaneously to explode away from her skeleton, while being forced straight down into the ground as compressed gas. Within the first 0.3 of a second following the bomb's detonation, most of the iron was going to be separated from Mrs. Aoyama's blood, as if by an atomic refinery. The top few millimeters of soil, as they converted to molten glass, would be shot through with such high concentrations of iron that, had the greenish-brown layer of glass been permitted to slowly cool, it would have been hidden beneath a sheet of carbon steel. But a slow and stately cooling was not to be. By the time the sound of the explosion reached her son Nenkai 2 kilometers away, all the substance of Mrs. Aoyama, including blood-derived iron and calcium-enriched glass, would be ascending toward the stratosphere to become part of the strange radioactive thunderstorms that were to chase after Nenkai and the other survivors. On the south side of town, more than 4 city blocks beyond Nenkai's mother and the monks, Toshihiko Matsuda was about to leave his shadow on a wall in his family's garden. He appeared to be bending down to pick a piece of fruit or to pull out a weed. During the next few milliseconds, the wall behind Toshihiko would be flash-printed not only with his shadow, but also with the ghost images of the plants that surrounded him, and which were providing his skin with some small measure of flash protection from the searing white glare. On the wall print, at the moment of the bomb's awakening, could be seen the shadow of a leaf that had just detached from its vine, and, though falling, would never reach the ground. From the Aoyama and Matsuda households to the shrimp boats in the harbor, human nervous systems were simply not fast enough to register how quickly the dawn of atomic death burst toward them on that August morning. In the beginning it had all unfolded within the realm of nanoseconds. Within the core of the reaction zone, approximately 560 grams, or 1.2 pounds, of uranium-235 began to undergo fission before the compressive shotgun-like forces designed to start the reaction and to hold it briefly together were overwhelmed by forces pushing it apart. While it held together, the business end of the bomb, the fraction of its uranium load that actually underwent fission, was astonishingly small. At the moment of compression, the most active ounces of the silvery neutron-emitting metal occupied only 1/3 of a golf ball's volume. The total volume of reacting uranium measured slightly more than 2 level teaspoons. Within that 1.2-pound, 2-teaspoon volume, enclosed, as within a clenched fist, by a larger uranium mantle barely wider than a peach, a sample of almost every element that had ever existed during the entire lifetime of the universe was instantly recreated, and many were just as quickly destroyed. After only 100 millionth of a second, the core began to expand and the fission reactions began to run down. During this 10-nanosecond interval, the first burst of light emerged with such intensity that even the violet and green portions of the spectrum, trailing slightly behind a huge burst of gamma rays, could be seen shining through the bomb steel casing as if the casing itself were a bag of transparent cellophane. 580 meters, 1,900 feet, below, no creature on the ground could see this. During the first 10 nanoseconds, light from the core traveled barely 10 feet in all directions. Fission reactions occurred within time frames so narrow that they actually bracketed the speed of light. Thus, from the perspective of anyone located more than 10 feet away, the bomb itself, though light was now blazing right through it, had not yet detonated and seemed to be perfectly intact. Directly below, Mrs. Aoyama was still alive and completely untouched by the flash. 1/10,000,000th of a second later, a sphere of gamma rays, escaping the core at light speed, reached a radius of 108 feet, with a secondary spray of neutrons following not very far behind. Between the gamma bubble and the newly formed neutron bubble, electrons were stripped from every atom of air and accelerated toward the outer reaches of the gamma sphere. A plasma bubble began to form, producing a thermal shock that spiked hotter than the sun's core and glowed billions of times brighter than the surface of the sun. Within this atomic flare, X-rays and gamma rays were repeatedly absorbed and scattered, polarized and reabsorbed, to such an extent that the rays were as likely to reflect back toward the center of the storm as away from it. A result of this was that by the time the light reached the ground, the gamma and X-ray bursts would be accompanied by a randomly scattering sky shine effect, by which a person shielded from the flash behind, for example, a solid brick wall, could still be pierced by rays emanating from all points of the compass. During its first millionth of a second, the bubble of light grew to a radius of 300 meters, barely more than 6 city blocks wide. Though its own expanding dimensions had thinned and cooled the sphere's outer boundary to only 1,000 times the boiling point of water, the temperature at the sphere's surface was more than 300 times that necessary to convert a human body to carbonized mist and incandescent bones. During this same first millionth of a second, the light from the bomb still had not traveled far enough to reach the city. If either Toshihiko Matsuda or Mrs. Aoyama happened to be looking at the blast point at precisely this moment, and were their nervous systems equipped to register 1/1,000,000th of a second, the 6-block-wide bubble would have appeared to them as an unexploded spear point in the sky. Above Matsuda and Aoyama, not merely unseen but unseeable, the bomb's neutron surge, though traveling at a substantial fraction of light speed, lagged behind its flash and its gamma burst. From the place where the bomb had been, from its magnetic poles, nuclei of tungsten and iron shot ahead of the neutrons as a spreading shower effect, no longer behaving as if they had ever been part of the structure. Behind them, the outracing spray of neutrons, and to a lesser degree protons and short-lived antiprotons, now became a significant secondary source of prompt and deadly radiation. After 1/10,000th of a second, the air began absorbing the burst and responding to it. The surrounding atmosphere developed into an expanding gulf of near-perfect vacuum, snapping away from the place where the bomb had been, forming a cave of plasma. Along the cavern's walls, the neutron spray generated a second great burst of gamma rays. By now the initial flash had traveled beyond the cave, out to a radius of 30 kilometers, approximately 18 miles, and the light was just beginning to be registered by the rapidly firing nervous systems of mantis shrimps on the bottom of Hiroshima harbor. Under the hypocenter, the blood in Mrs. Aoyama's brain was already beginning to vibrate, on the verge of flashing to vapor. What she experienced was one of the fastest deaths in human history. Before a single nerve could begin to sense pain, she and her nerves ceased to be. Several city blocks away, Toshihiko Matsuda and the plants that surrounded him would live a while longer. At a radius of 10 city blocks, koi and turtles swimming just below the surface of Hiroshima Castle's ponds would still be alive the next day, though before they could even begin to flinch or seek deeper water they were going blind, with the scales and shells on their backs already searing. Reaction times were slowing down now, shifting from quantum time frames into the realm of biological time. During the next 3 milliseconds, a span in which a housefly could execute a single wing flap and start to alter course, the fireball began to form. Initially, it expanded at 100 times the speed of sound, but by the time its lower surface neared the Hiroshima dome and the roof of the Matsuda house, 97 milliseconds and 31 wing flaps later, it was down to only a 50th of its initial velocity. Near the periphery of the fireball, new fission-generated atoms with very short half-lives were undergoing rapid decay, sending forth a third gamma-ray burst. For all its capacity to cause harm, this third death ray was dwarfed by the heat ray that preceded it and by the gathering storm of a shock wave laced with lightning. Throughout Hiroshima, 1/10 of a second after detonation, telephone wires and clothing began to send forth vertical columns of black vapor, yet all the buildings of the city still stood during these first 100 milliseconds. Compared to its beginnings, the shock wave was now sluggish. This slowest of the 3 major atomic bubbles touched the earth at only twice the speed of sound, scarcely faster than human reflexes. People require a full 30th of a second to register motion, a 10th of a second to flinch. The neural pathways of flies fire and reset, scan and respond, almost 50 times faster than a human brain. From the fly's perspective, humans all but stand still, living in a universe of slowed time, much as humans view the time frames of garden-variety slugs and snails. For miles in every direction, flies registered the initial pulse of light less than 5 milliseconds after it reached the ground, and they were capable of changing course and seeking shade 100 milliseconds later, during the next 30 wing flaps, or within the average blink or flinch interval of human time. After 300 milliseconds, or 3/10 of a second, the fireball had reached its maximum potential for inflicting flash burns at a distance, but by then most of Hiroshima's flies were already sheltering in the shadows of the nearest walls, or under the nearest leaves, or behind the nearest people. The gamma-ray skyshine effect scarcely mattered to them, because a fly's DNA repair systems were nearly 200 times more efficient than a man's. At 3/10 of a second, the bomb itself was long gone. Everything that followed, as events shifted from bullet time and fly time into time frames humans knew best, signified nothing more than aftershocks. Akiko Takakura and her friend Asami, though nearer to the bomb than Toshihiko Matsuda and his shadow garden, were located deep within the granite and concrete shell of the Geibi Bank when the gamma and infrared bursts started. Except for random shafts of skyshine that came in through the windows in the building's sides, the two women were more or less cocooned against the death rays. Akiko would always remember how the clock in the main gallery stopped at 8:15, the same time that the big clock atop the Hiroshima University Tower had stopped 3 days earlier. Because the war effort had drained almost all manpower and all spare metal parts, the resources to repair the city's main timepiece were lacking. During the past 3 days, Akiko and Asami had joked about how the broken clock tower frozen seemingly forever at 8:15, underscored the futility of everything. For decades to come, they are jokes.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?